Jess, we want both. Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for being here in Washington, and welcome to our audience online. We're so happy to have you here today to talk about this important topic. Today's session is entitled Small Packages, Big Questions, Valuing the De Minimis Exemption. And I think we have a great lineup of speakers today. When this issue came in front of my desk, I was surprised by it. I hadn't really given it much thought. And I started to read what's out there in the press and in various pieces written by think tanks and government agencies. And I found that there was a lot of myth and speculation. And I thought, really, there must be more known. And it turns out there is a lot more known. In fact, Customs and Border Patrol alone puts out a lot of information, facts about what de minimis really is. So today we have a lineup of folks who have a lot of experience in this area, have done original research in this area, have worked in operations, and so I hope we can shed some important light on this issue. Now, the Census Bureau estimates that e-commerce accounts for more than 15% of total retail sales in 2024, and obviously it's growing. About 1/5 of these sales are for products that enter the country duty-free because of what is known as the de minimis exemption. Now, this exemption allows up to $800 in imported goods per person per day, formerly known as Section 321 exemption, and a person can import those not only free of tariffs, but free of the administrative fees that are charged for customs clearance. So it's a big saving for consumers of low-value items. De minimis shipments have grown rapidly in recent years, as many people know, due to a number of factors, including the rise of the threshold for de minimis packages. In 2016, it was increased from $200 value packages up to a maximum of $800. It's also been I would say, promoted by the quick facilitation of our own Border Patrol. These packages move much more quickly. And of course, by rising tariffs on China, it's a way to avoid tariffs that can be up to 25% under Section 301, more in other cases. And of course, the growing popularity of online retail sales. So all those combined have led to a big increase in the number of packages that U.S. Customs and Border Patrol have to process at the border. CPB reports processing about 4 million de minimis shipments a day, which is up from 2.8 million only a year ago. So this is a very fast-growing area of trade. Federal lawmakers are now considering a handful of proposals to alter or eliminate the de minimis exemption. Our expert panel will discuss why de minimis shipments are permitted, how CPB manages the program, why it has grown so much. We'll also explore the value of de minimis to small businesses, the consequences of on American family budgets if it's eliminated, its relation to trade tensions with China, and concerns about its use as a pathway for unsafe goods and narcotics. Following our speakers, we will open up the floor with questions of my own, but then we welcome Q&A questions from people here at our in-house audience. I will now introduce our speakers in the order in which they will be speaking. Our first speaker will be Amit Khandelwal, who is the Dong Soo Hong Professor of Global Affairs and Economics at Yale University. Dr. Khandelwal is a senior faculty member at the Jackson School of Global Affairs at Yale. Previously, he was professor of global business and chair of the economics division at Columbia Business School. He holds affiliations with the National Bureau of Economic Research, Council on Foreign Relations, and he served very recently as an editor of the Review of Economics and Statistics. Dr. Khandelwal's research focuses on the link between international trade and economic development. Most recently, Amit's work has been highlighted in the press because of important work he co-authored on the economic impact of the U.S.-China trade war, which began in 2018. Amit recently completed with a co-author an empirical study of the value of de minimis imports and the implications of eliminating the provision. And he will share some of those findings with us today. So we're very pleased to have Amit with us, who will be joining us virtually from New Haven. Our second speaker will be Gary Clyde Huffbauer, non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute. Dr. Huffbauer was the Institute's Reginald Jones Senior Fellow until 2018. He has held prestigious academic and think tank positions, as well as serving as Deputy Assistant Secretary for International Trade and Investment Policy of the U.S. Treasury and Director of the International Tax Staff at the Treasury. Dr. Huffbauer has written extensively on international trade, investment, and tax issues. Our third speaker is Todd C. Owens, President of Cross-Border Advisory Network, former Executive Assistant Commissioner for Field Operations, U.S. Customs and Border Patrol. Currently in private practice, Ted Owens served as Executive Assistant Commissioner, Office of Field Operations, U.S. Customs and Border Patrol, until quite recently. He oversaw more than 29,000 employees, including more than 24,000 CPB officers and specialists. He managed an annual budget of over $5 million for operations at CPB's ports of entry and numerous programs that supported national security and the facilitation of lawful trade. Prior to this executive position, he held management and operational positions in what I think is easy to say are probably the easiest assignments that CPB has, namely Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., New Orleans, and South Florida, some of the toughest areas for CPB operations. So I welcome our three speakers. I believe Gary and Todd, I would like to welcome you to the stage if you like, or if you'd like to hear Dr. Khandelwal's presentation from there, that would be fine too. And let's see if we can welcome Dr. Amit on screen.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you, Amit.
Excellent. Thanks, Mary, for that great introduction, and I'm very happy to join this event. I wish I could be there in person. So as Mary said, I've been working on the issue of de minimis imports, which I actually did not know much about prior to working on this topic. We've written a paper trying to understand the impacts of allowing for this exemption on goods that fall below a certain threshold to arrive into the country, free of duties and administrative burdens. And so I'm just going to share some top-line findings of that work this morning. This is a project that I've been working on with Pablo Fagobaum, who's at UCLA. Okay, so as Mary mentioned, Section 321 of the 1930 Tariff Act allows up to $800 per person per day to enter into the country free of tariffs and with minimal customs burden. And we have seen a very rapid rise in de minimis imports into the United States. So just about 10 years ago, there were 110 million shipments coming into the country valued at approximately $50 million. And just last year, we saw 1 billion shipments coming in with a 1,000-fold increase in their values and entering at a total value of $54 billion. And if you look at CBP's official statistics this year, through the third quarter of 2024, we had already received 1 billion shipments with roughly $50 billion, valued at roughly $50 billion. And so it's safe to say that by the end of the year, we will surpass that number. Now, there's different ways to benchmark how important this is to the U.S. economy. The U.S. imports about $3.5 trillion worth of goods every year. A large fraction of those goods are intermediate inputs, and so they're not necessarily used for final consumption. And so if you strip out the intermediate inputs from our imports and just focus on imports of final goods, then this $54 billion number here last year was about 7% of consumer imports or final consumption imports. Another way to benchmark this is, a lot of the shipments that are coming in through the de minimis channel are facilitated by online platforms directly for consumer final consumption. And so a natural benchmark to consider this $54 billion number is to consider the total US e-commerce market. And so according to official statistics, de minimis imports would be roughly 20% of the total e-commerce market in the United States. So this is a very fast and important way in which consumers are now sourcing their consumption rather than having imports coming in through into domestic warehouses, which then get either purchased from a retail store or shipped domestically through online platforms. Consumers can now receive packages directly from the origin. Okay, now the large rise in de minimis imports has given way to active debates over de minimis policies that are not just happening here in the United States, but all throughout both the developed and developing world. And Mary touched upon a few reasons and sources driving this growth in low value shipments. One of them is just a technological or logistics revolution that enables platforms to now connect producers from overseas facilities directly to consumers. There's also been a streamlining of the processing of these shipments that I guess will be touched upon in the operational section of the event. And so in the United States, we have 5 bipartisan bills in Congress that are currently debating restricting different provisions of de minimis imports. And as many of you may know, just in September, the Biden administration issued an executive order that would now impose the Section 321 tariffs on imports from China. And so the tariffs on those goods that even if they're below $800 would now be roughly 15 to 25%, depending on the type of product. This is not just an issue that's being debated in the US. So the EU has recently scrapped its de minimis exemption of 150 euros. The UK is debating it. South Africa, Philippines, Turkey, Brazil, Chile. These are all examples of countries that are weighing whether to remove the exemption of these types of low value shipments. And so what we tried to do in this paper is simply to understand what is the value of having this exemption, who benefits, what is the aggregate implications of having this exemption, and which types of consumers are going to benefit the most or the least from this type of exemption. Okay, now the difficulty of trying to analyze de minimis shipments is that the standard data that trade economists all use to analyze U.S. imports come from census, but census only tracks shipments above a certain threshold of $2,000, and which means that any data that's compiled from census data misses the rise in de minimis shipments that we've been seeing. And so as a result, we've used data from 3 large international carriers who handle the movement of these packages from overseas into the United States. These 3 carriers collectively account for about a third of Section 321 value, or about 15% of their shipments. And the nice thing that we can see in this data set is that we can see the full range of shipments ranging from a $1 shipment all the way up to potentially several hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of shipments if a large business is importing something from overseas. And so what this means is that we can observe the distribution of shipments in the range of where the de minimis threshold is, which is from $0 to $800. Now, these 3 carriers may not be a fully representative sample of where the de minimis shipments are coming from or who the de minimis shipments are being delivered to. And so we've tried to complement this data set with a data set directly from Customs, Border and Protection, which provides us the total number of shipments coming into the country over 1 week from 2017 to 2022, up to $1,500. And this came via a FOIA request from CBP, and we can then see the total shipments coming into the country, again, around this threshold. Now, both the interesting features of these 2 data sets is that we can observe the destination zip code to which these shipments are going to. And therefore, we're able to link, which I think is for the first time, a sense of the types of the consumer demographics that are engaged in this form of trade. And so we can link it to household median incomes of a zip code or particular demographics of the zip code, such as the age distribution, minority household shares, retail density, and so forth. And so just to summarize the main findings, which are really things that just fall directly out from basic summary statistics from the data, is that we tend to see that in both samples, both the CBP sample and the carrier sample, poorer zip codes in terms of median household incomes tend to spend relatively more of their income and of their spending on direct shipments on these low value shipments. So if you take the total number of shipments coming into a zip code and you also take the total number of shipments that are below the $800 threshold, the share of shipments that are falling under the de minimis threshold is relatively higher in poorer zip codes. Now, when you unpack where those de minimis shipments are coming from, we tend to find that poorer zip codes tend to spend relatively more on de minimis shipments coming from the currently high tariff origin into this country, which is China. And so if you take those two features together, that the poorer zip codes spend relatively more on de minimis shipments, and these de minimis shipments are more likely to be purchased from China, you're going to find, just very straightforwardly, that Section 321 is a progressive trade policy. The effective tariff that poorer zip codes face on imports is relatively lower than the tariff rate that a higher income zip code will face. And as a result, if you remove Section 321, you're going to flip a progressive tariff policy into a regressive one. And so we can then further go on to assess the aggregate implications or the aggregate losses to consumers if the Section 321 is removed. And so if 321 is removed, we're going to see an imposition of tariffs and an imposition of administrative fees to process these shipments. And so if you then, if imagine the government does this, the tariff revenue will be something that the government can collect. But if we then assume that it can go back to the consumers, we're going to find that this is going to lead to an aggregate loss as a result of higher prices of around $11 billion, or slightly more if we use the CBP sample. Now, to give you a sense of what $11 billion means in terms of consumer losses, in some previous work that we had done on the U.S.-China trade war, which is studying effectively the full Section 301 tariffs, we found a consumer loss that included the tariff rebates back to consumers of about $50 billion. So our benchmark estimates suggest that consumer losses through the removal of de minimis shipments exemptions would be roughly 1/5 the value of the trade war. Now, we can then further unpack who's going to gain relatively more versus less from the eliminating the de minimis shipments. And the estimates that we find in terms of the per capita consumer losses really flow from the earlier kind of summary statistics on who spends more on de minimis shipments than others. And so what we're going to find is that the per capita loss in zip codes that have below $45,000 in median household income will be about $44 per person per year. It'll be higher for higher income zip codes, but when you scale these numbers by the median household income in a zip code, you're going to quickly see that the poor are going to be hurt relatively more than the rich if 321 is removed. And likewise, you can do the same analysis where you instead think about zip codes in terms of minority household shares. And what we would find here is that heavily minority household zip codes are going to lose relatively more, both in absolute terms and as a share of their income, as a result of any full elimination of Section 321. Okay, so I think I'm just about out of time there, but this gives you a sense of kind of an overview of 321 and where the potential incidence of any changes to Section 321 policy may lie.
Great. Thank you so much, Amit. I'd like to turn now to Gary Huffbauer. Gary, please.
Here we go. Thanks very much, Mary, and thank you for everyone who's here. Drink here. I doubt that any of these congressmen and senators who are attacking de minimis have actually read what Amit has just presented. The attacks are totally devoid of any factual information and are based on misleading emotional appeals. 3 points being emphasized: consumer safety, drug protection, and so-called fair tariff. So I'm going to kind of place Socrates and interrogate these phrases which have been used. It's all phrases, nothing to do with data on trying to repeal de minimis. So here we have several senators who tell us that restricting de minimis is going to protect American consumers. And so you have to ask, how do you protect consumers by denying them the ability to purchase foreign goods? And of course, the supporters of repealing de minimis are outfits like the textile organizations. These same 5 senators talk about halting, halting the flood. Can you hear me now? Yeah. Halting the flood of illicit packages. They talk about this flood of illicit packages. Well, we know from what Amit has said that there's a lot of shipments coming in, and it's increased very rapidly. But and Todd will speak more to this. But what percentage contain illicit goods? There are obviously ways of screening them out, which Todd will speak to, without repealing de minimis. And then we come to the real kicker, which is that the legislation to repeal de minimis will close the gateway for fentanyl. I mean, this is absurd, but I'm going to let Todd go into details. However, Mark Noland, who is here, was the one who informed me that all the fentanyl that comes into the U.S. can come into a single tractor trailer load. And you're not going to send fentanyl by de minimis packages when you can bring it in from Mexico, which is adjacent to where I live, so much more easily. These numbers, Amit has gone through those. The point I would make is that while there has been a big increase, the numbers are relatively modest compared to total imports, even if you take final consumer goods, which Amit is, I think it comes out to about 600-700 billion. The de minimis is a fraction of that. And there have been complaints that maybe de minimis is hurting small specialty retailers. I looked up the data on this, and according to the National Federation of Retailers, small specialty retailers have revenue of about $70 billion a year, and there are about 150,000 of them. The big box retailers have revenue of about $5 trillion a year. So you have to ask yourself, when you buy something, a package from Mexico or Indonesia or China or wherever, who are you substituting against? Much more likely you're substituting against the big box retailers than the small specialty retailers. And as Mary said at the beginning, this is the only program by which consumers can import, free of hassle, free of tariffs, but also free of kind of administrative burdens. Well, so then the word circumvent, and I know this is all language, not numbers, but that's the attack is on language. So circumvent is a big word that's used. Well, you know, when we have a free trade agreement, that circumvents. When we have trade between New Mexico, where I live, and California, that circumvents tariffs. And when we have a generalized system of preferences, that, so the word circumvent makes it sound it's bad to not pay the tariffs, but in fact, it's good to not pay the tariffs, and we have a number of programs which do that. Well, then we have more about risk. I mean, that it's putting consumers at risk. This is just nonsense. And even though it was spoken by the president, and it's really a benefit, not a risk. And then another word that's used is this dangerous loophole. Again, the notion that if you don't pay a tariff, you're doing something wrong, where in fact we have these other programs, which exactly the purpose of them is to not pay the tariff to encourage trade. And then it gets blended into the Uyghur forced labor prevention and so forth, but there are plenty of ways, and Todd can talk about that, of dealing with that. These assertions, which are really driving the legislation which Amit talked about, these 5 bills, they have no quantitative basis, no factual basis. They're based on choosing words that make it all sound kind of dodgy and harmful to have the de minimis program. And I guess the last thing I would say, which I don't have a slide for, but let's emphasize the point that Amit made. Not everyone can afford a trip to Paris or Shanghai to bring back $800 of goods, which you can do. And nobody's attacking that. So high-income people can bring in $800 on their travels, but low-income people, like where I live in northern New Mexico, they go to the post office and pick up their packages, and there are an awful lot of them, especially during the Christmas season. And that's what Congress wants to, or some congressmen, I should say, want to close all that. And it's really an anti-poor policy which is being driven through. Amit used the nice technical term regressive, but it's really anti-poor. This is what's going on in this piece of repeal legislation. And I can't help but say that, there's no congressman from New Mexico is supporting this. It's congressmen from very high-income places like San Francisco and Portland and Boston. So it really should. Hopefully, this program will put an end to this legislation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gary. I'd now like to ask Todd Owen to come to this stage.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I'd like to thank Mary. I'd like to thank the Peterson Institute for inviting me to speak a little bit about de minimis. As Mary said, my name is Todd Owen, and I am retired from U.S. Customs and Border Protection. I spent 30 years in the agency in different frontline and leadership positions in Miami, Los Angeles, New Orleans, and 2 tours here in Washington, D.C. and headquarters. At the time of my retirement, I was serving as the Executive Assistant Commissioner for the Office of Field Operations that oversees the 328 ports of entry in the country, the legal crossings for things and people and things to come into the country. I was in that role for my last 5.5 years of my career, and it was during that time that the Trade Facilitation and Trade Enforcement Act came into play in 2015, implemented in 2016, and that's what raised the de minimis value from $200 to $800. And Gary just mentioned the $800. Many people don't understand why was $800 chosen. And the reason for that is when you come into the country as a traveler, you are allowed an $800 personal exemption. So to have parity with what you could bring in through mail or through express courier, that $800 was chosen to be fair for what you could bring in as an individual versus what you can now bring in through the de minimis provision. So that's why The legislation in 2015 moved it from $200 up to $800. So it was during my career at that time, 2015, 16, 17, when we experienced firsthand the impacts of the increase with the de minimis legislation. This, again, aligned with more direct-to-consumer, more e-commerce, so there was many things driving this rapid increase in small parcels. And from the perspective of the CBP officer, the frontline officer, they look at this challenge as a small parcel threat, right? They're not focused so much on de minimis or the different types of entry mechanisms, because really at the end of the day, all de minimis is, it's a different mechanism to bring cargo into the country. It allows for duty-free and it allows for less burdensome requirements, but it is, again, just one of several mechanisms to bring your cargo into the country. So from the perspective of the frontline officer, they're looking at, again, 4 million small parcels a day and the threat that can be found in any of those small parcels. And to put this in context, if you look at what else CBP does every day, in addition to addressing those 4 million parcels, 1.1 million travelers cross our borders every day. These are legal travelers. These are not the migrant issues. These are 1.1 million folks crossing our borders through our airports, about 350,000 a day through the airports, and about 680,000 from our border with Mexico, and the remaining from Canada and through our seaports. So 1 million travelers a day, 4 million packages a day, 100,000 trucks, rail cars, and maritime containers a day, and 250,000 passenger vehicles a day cross our borders every single day. CBP will process over 100,000 entries each day, collecting about $253 million. So when you look at the scope of what CBP officers are faced with every day, it's pretty daunting, it's pretty overwhelming. And again, that small parcel threat needs to be understood in the context of everything else that CBP does. So let's talk about some of the misconceptions that are out there about small parcels and de minimis, right? By law, every cargo shipment that enters the country has to provide advanced electronic manifest data, has to declare to customs what's in it, who it's going to, where it's coming from, and different data points. So whether it's a 40-foot maritime container, a truck, a rail car, air cargo shipment, or a de minimis package, those advanced manifest requirements by law, by the Trade Act of 2002, have to be submitted to CBP. CBP takes that advanced information, it bounces it through its automated targeting system, ATS, where we help assign risk to every shipment. Those shipments that rise to the top because there is a concern are the shipments that are held for inspection. There's also a regime of random inspections, different types of enforcement sweeps, different enforcement tools that we have out there. So some of this misconception out there that de minimis shipments don't require any data. CBP knows nothing about de minimis shipments. Not true. That de minimis shipments are not targeted by CBP. Not true. That de minimis shipments are not inspected by CBP. Not true. So all of that that's been out there is not true. What is true is de minimis packages are exempt from duty and they come in under a less burdensome requirement, less burdensome customs filings that don't have the fees associated with them. So when you look at, again, this is just one mechanism of many for cargo to come into that. So when you view de minimis, really look at it as a cargo release mechanism, one that facilitates low volume entries, very quick processing, which helps the carriers, it helps the small business, it helps the direct-to-consumer market, it helps the e-commerce market, because if you look at the average value of a de minimis, and this is from CBP data, it's $56. So this is very low value. If you remove de minimis and have them file entry as either an informal entry or a formal entry, then different types of fees associated with that, attached to that. Often those fees will end up being more than what the cargo itself is worth. So I think that's an important item to keep in mind here. So when you talk to the frontline officers, again, about the small parcel threat, they don't differentiate in their mind whether it's de minimis, Type 86, informal, formal, because at the time they're performing their inspections, when the cargo first arrives, those entry documents, that mechanism to clear has generally not been filed. They don't know. When the JFK International Mail Facility and the CBP officers are looking at their 1 million de minimis parcels every day, they don't know that it's going to be filed as a de minimis entry by the carrier or a type 86 by a customs broker or an informal or formal entry, they're looking at the small parcel threat in front of them. And when they're putting package after package through x-ray systems, when the dogs are running them, the narcotics detection dogs, they're not skipping over the de minimis packages because they don't know which ones are de minimis. They're, again, looking at that holistic 4 million parcels a day and what could be the threat within each one of those parcels. So when we look at the different legislation that's out there, and will adjusting the threshold, will eliminating certain countries of origin from the calculation, will that help secure the border any better? Again, speaking as myself, not as for CBP, I will tell you that that action alone is doubtful to have a positive impact on border security. And the reason for that, again, these 4 million parcels are not going to stop coming. Whether they're entered and cleared as a de minimis shipment or an informal shipment or a formal shipment, they're still coming. You're still dealing with 4 million parcels a day. Drug smugglers, big surprise, don't accurately tell you what's in the shipment, and they don't care about the value. So they don't care whether the de minimis is 200 or 800. They are playing in the volumes. And 4 million small parcels a day gives them plenty of room to play in, okay? If you want to address the small parcel threat and everything that that Gary mentioned about unsafe products, the fentanyl, everything that's that could possibly be involved, CBP needs 4 things. They need better data, better advanced data that is accurate, and they need legislation to support stricter penalties against those that are not filing with accurate or complete data. They need better inspection technology, and this can be the game changer. If you were to look at one of these 6 international mail facilities or one of the 24 express courier hubs where the cargo comes in, these small parcels come in, the inspection technology that's being used is archaic. It is old 2-dimensional x-ray systems where an officer is looking at the computer screen manually at each box that's going through and trying to identify an anomaly. There is more effective, higher technology that's currently available now and deployed, and you could just turn to TSA as the example. The computed tomography, the x-ray diffraction, even some millimeter wave technologies allow for automatic threat detection through the algorithms. TSA uses this computed tomography equipment very effectively. All of your checked bags pass through CT equipment in most airports, and that will detect threats to aviation, primarily explosives and things of that nature. We need the same technology at the mail facilities to allow CBP to do this. The big difference is why CBP doesn't have this and TSA does. It's the funding from Congress. TSA has something that's known as the Aviation Security Capital Fund that provides a guarantee of $250 million every year to refresh and expand on their advanced screening technology. CBP has no such comparable legislation. So CBP is at the mercy of Congress every year whether or not they are going to plus up the technology budget or are they only going to give you enough to keep running what you have. Most years, you keep running those old 2-dimensional x-ray systems in the mail facilities that are less effective than some of the modern technology that's out there. So again, if you want to address the small parcel threat, better data, better technology, better funding, and I will close with the staffing. CBP is currently under their staffing needs by over 4,800 officers. Every year, CBP publishes a report to Congress known as the workload staffing model that looks at everything CBP has to do, those 250,000 cars a day, those 100,000 trucks and maritime containers. And it can determine, based on the data, how many officers it needs to address the threats it faces. CBP is under 4,800 officers than what it needs, than what Congress has authorized and appropriated. So if you wanted to really address the small parcel threat, you'll be more effective focusing on the advanced data, the technology, and the personnel that are needed, rather than adjusting threshold limits or excluding different countries of origin. So before I close very quickly, I do want to just address the fentanyl threat because we've heard that earlier and I'm sure it will come up. When fentanyl first started coming into the country and was first starting to be detected around 2014, 2015, CBP, like most law enforcement agencies in this country, were not prepared for the fentanyl threat. The narcotics detection equipment, the identification equipment that we had wasn't picking up as fentanyl. When you have different narcotics test kits, it detected it as an other opioid. So we were finding things, but we weren't aware that they are fentanyl because we didn't have the right testing equipment. Our narcotics dogs in 2015 were not trained to detect fentanyl. The X-ray equipment still today is very challenged to detect that type of threat. So throughout 2016, 2017, the narcotics dogs became trained on fentanyl. The handheld testing and identify equipment was pulled out, was provided to the fields. We became much more effective at detecting and identifying the fentanyl that was coming in. That was going on. We were also engaging with China at the State Department level to get them to do more. In 2019, China changed its narcotics laws where they scheduled fentanyl as an illegal drug in their country. And what that basically means is prior, fentanyl was viewed mostly in the commercial sense. Now it was an illegal substance in China. What that did was drive the Chinese chemists, the production of fentanyl from China into Mexico. And if you look at the fentanyl threat today, whereas in 2015, 2016, 17, you had very small quantities of fentanyl with very high purity coming into the United States to the mail facilities and express courier hubs. Today, 96% of your fentanyl in this country is coming in two field offices, Arizona and Southern California. When you look at the 278,000 pounds of fentanyl that CBP seized last year, and all of these statistics are on their website, 90% of that was seized along the southern border. So those 200,000 cars a day that are coming in from Mexico, that is the pathway now to get your fentanyl into the country. That is a passenger vehicle issue. That is not a de minimis issue. If you want to address the fentanyl threat, you need to address the southern border, again, through inspection technology, personnel, because that's where your fentanyl threat is coming today. There's still some that comes in through the mail facilities, but it is nowhere near what we are seeing on the southern border. So I thank you for your time. I hope this has been somewhat informative, and happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all three of our speakers for such informative commentary. I see I want to be cognizant of time. I have a few questions for each of you. Amit, let me start with you and your fascinating study. You provide a lot of detail on who you think would be hurt by repeal. And I'd like to just for you to elaborate a little bit on what it means. So you analyze the extent to which so-called aggregate welfare, as well as the welfare of low-income consumers, would be hurt by elimination of the exemption. What do you mean by aggregate welfare? You talk about demand responses, tariff rebates. Can you put that in plain English? How exactly would low-income households, or households really of any income, be affected by the elimination?
Sure. So let's just think about the number from last year, so $50 billion worth of de minimis imports. So now imagine Section 321 is removed. If Section 321 is removed, two things are going to happen. You're going to see an imposition of tariffs, roughly 20% on the stuff coming in from China, much lower for the stuff coming in from the rest of the world. And then you're also going to see an administrative processing fee, which includes the cost of hiring a broker in order to facilitate the movement of the package across the border. So our estimates suggest that this would approximately lead to a 20 to 25% increase in prices as a result of that. So now you have $50 billion, and now prices are going to, worth of stuff, and prices are going to go up by 20 to 25%. So that's roughly one way to think about the losses in the form of higher prices. Now, the issue is there's two issues with that. So one is not every consumer, as I mentioned, or different zip codes across the country. Some zip codes buy more from China, some zip codes buy less from China. The zip codes that are buying more from platforms that facilitate imports from China are going to be hit higher because their tariffs on Chinese goods are higher. And so their losses will be a little bit more than zip codes who don't buy anything from China. But then you're also going to see that when prices go up, people buy less of it. And so buying less of it means that the consumer is not going to, suddenly, still maintain all of their de minimis imports because prices are higher. They're going to start to shift their consumption into maybe, offline stores. And so part of what the paper does is try to figure out, well, when prices go up by 10%, how much less do people buy from de minimis? Is it 5%? Is it 2%? Is it 7%? And so a lot of the technical parts of the paper is trying to come up with that number. But really the way to think about this is take whatever you've purchased last year. Some of that comes from China, some of that comes from Canada, some of that is American. And now imagine you eliminate the exemption, prices are going to go up by 20%. If half of the stuff I buy from China goes up by 20%, then the cost of your basket of goods is going to go up by 50% times 20%. So that's roughly how we get to those numbers.
Great, thank you so much, Amit. Gary, for you, so an important rationale that was used to argue in favor of raising the de minimis exemption back in 2015 was not only the issue that you raised about people being able to bring things in from their trip to Paris, but also there was argument that it would help small businesses importing inexpensive parts and supplies. But now we hear a lot of talk about how de minimis is eroding U.S. competitiveness. And the idea here is that U.S. companies are producing things that compete with these cheap imports. And gone from the discussion is any talk about small businesses importing, packing tape or whatever else, or small parts that they use in their own production process. Can you talk a little bit about the impact of de minimis on U.S. business competitiveness?
Yeah. Well, I've seen some small firms in northern New Mexico and in Santa Fe, middle New Mexico, which take advantage of de minimis to expand the range of products that they offer. So they can buy $800 of whatever it be. It might be a pottery item or a textile item, and add it to their wares. So that's one side of it. The other side is the argument that has been made that you mentioned, Mary, that people, instead of going to these small retailers, they buy over, using e-commerce, and most of de minimis is an e-commerce transaction from abroad, whether it be China or Europe or whatever. The data I've seen is that people who go to to specialty stores, they like to shop that way. I mean, that's they want to go in, they want to see the kind of wares, jewelry, whatever. There's a great sympathy for going to specialty stores. The competition, I think, that de minimis brings is, as I said, to the big box, to Target, Walmart, those kind of firms, where if you go de minimis, you avoid the retail markup, and maybe you get exactly what you want, which is not quite the item which is in the big box stores. So I think this argument that it's killing small business or is damaging firms is just it's basically misguided. It's a basic protection argument which is not factually based.
Okay, thanks, Gary. Todd, you explained very clearly how certain risks, especially, for example, the movement of fentanyl supplies into the United States, are no longer really an issue for de minimis shipments. The action has shifted to the southern border. But there's two other claims that reflect, I think, concerns people have about de minimis shipments. First, some people worry that these products are unsafe because, quote, the product specifications cannot be verified. And a second worry is that some people feel that foreign companies are just sending large shipments into Mexico that are broken up and sent into the U.S., so basically another way to avoid tariffs. Can you speak to either of those concerns or both?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some validity to that. When you have 4 million small parcels a day, there will be threats within that universe, right? We saw the fentanyl threat shift from China into Mexico but you will still find some unsafe products. You will find some products that are misdeclared. That's why the targeting systems that CBP has, along with the other federal agencies, the Consumer Product Safety Commission, the FDA, they work very closely to try to identify those threats that are in that 4 million parcel stream a day. But again, there is an overwhelming volume every single day, and you will find some bad actors hiding in the numbers. In terms of parcels being broken down into Mexico, you will see that. You will see that in Canada as well, and they will come across the land border. So whenever you have new legislation, there will be people that will find ways to evade it. That's why, again, stricter legislation. CBP is pushing the 21st Century Customs Framework, which adds greater penalties for things like not properly describing your cargo, the accuracy, different things like that. Better technology to help interdict these threats, more personnel at the borders to do that. This is where you can start to bring change. But de minimis is a benefit for, again, the small consumer, the direct-to-consumer market, the small business. It's a benefit to the carriers because they can quickly release these small parcels. If you go to any express courier operation, these are night operations. They come alive from about 10 p.m. to about 4 a.m. And in that time, plane after plane after plane is bringing in the small parcels. Because of de minimis, they can process them through, a streamlined release mechanism and get those products out the door by the morning run where they're back on different planes now domestically for delivery. If de minimis, if that mechanism is gone, you will lose that quick turnaround, and it'll be more burdensome on CBP to process that, because you'll have cargo that will be held till the next day for formal entries to be filed, to be processed, and you'll start to see congestion and backups in all of your express courier hubs and your mail facilities, as well as, again, of course, having a negative impact on the just-in-time, the direct-to-consumer market that expects their goods to be delivered relatively quickly. So there is a negative impact on CBP to do this too, as well as the negative impact on the carriers and the small business and the average consumer.
So if we have a question from the audience, could you please go to the microphone so that our online audience can also hear the question? While you're getting ready, I'm going to just ask Todd a quick follow-up. Todd, were you able to speculate a little bit here, because this is not based on experience, but what you would expect in the future? You know, if we think about these large shipments going into Canada or Mexico to being broken up, they're basically doing this to avoid tariffs. Placing tariffs on these shipments, will it make this problem worse?
Well, the goods still have to be properly declared when they cross the border. So if the goods are made in China, even though they're broken up in Mexico, they will still be subject to the Chinese tariffs. So it won't evade that unless, of course, the people are flat out lying as to the origin and things of that nature. But breaking up foreign-made products into Mexico, the origin is what dictates the application of the tariffs. So the Chinese goods will still be subject to the Chinese tariffs if they're coming in through San Diego or they're coming in through JFK Airport.
Thank you. Please.
Thank you. Steve Charnovitz at George Washington University. As a consumer and as a citizen, I share Gary Socrates' skepticism that tariffs are the natural order of things. So in my view, de minimis is it's the biggest bright spot of U.S. trade policy. The growth in de minimis imports is the best thing that's happened in U.S. trade policy in at least 4 years. But as a lawyer, I have a different question. Because looking at Section 321, what it says is that the Secretary of the Treasury is authorized to prescribe regulations for importation of goods under $800 without duty, and that the Secretary of the Treasury can change these regulations. So I'm puzzled, maybe to give this to Todd, I'm puzzled why there isn't authority under the current law for the program to be revised to deal with the supposed problems that exist, or even to eliminate de minimis, because unlike other provisions in the Tariff Act of 1930, this one doesn't read to me as an obligation, but rather as an authority to the Secretary.
Yeah, and again, I'm not a lawyer, so just speaking as an operator, I mean, everything you're saying makes sense to me. It took the Trade Facilitation and Trade Enforcement Act, an act of Congress in 2015, to raise that de minimis. It wasn't allowed by an executive order by the Treasury Secretary or the Customs Commissioner. It had to be an act of Congress to raise that. So everything you're saying, sir, appears to align with what would be required. But again, not being a lawyer, I really can't speak to that beyond that.
Gary, you're a lawyer. Would you like to hop in there?
Well, thanks, Steve. I looked at this. I was kind of involved with some of the express firms back in 2016 when the law was changed, and I looked at it at the time, and it seemed to me that the Treasury could have done it on its own by the provision that you've just cited, that I recall now that you reminded me reading. But I think it was a big enough step that the Treasury didn't want to do that without congressional authorization. So we got the law, and then we had the change. But the statute you read, it possibly could have been done just by executive order at that time.
Thank you. I think we have time for discussion on one more topic, and I'd like to bring up the question of fairness, and I'd like to start with you, Amit. So one of the things I hear from people is, oh, I don't care about this de minimis, because really what it is it's Temu and it's Shein bringing in a lot of fast fashion that's going to end up in, landfills anyway. And to me, it's always sounded like I get to pick what other people consume. But I wonder how you react to this issue. Is de minimis fair?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think there's a number of ways to think about this. You mentioned the fast fashion point, which is something that, to be honest, has also come up when I've given this presentation to UK regulators, for example. I think there's a couple of things here. So one is, yes, this may be an issue in terms of just fast fashion, whether it's coming through de minimis or through standard channels. And the way that economists think about this is that there is an environmental externality that we need to be considering. The question is whether de minimis will change the rate of fast fashion. And that, I think, is not so clear. We have lots of large retailers who pioneered fast fashion, such as H&M and Zara and so forth. And so I guess the open question is whether if you shift these goods from the de minimis channel into a formal channel, will that necessarily change the rate at which clothing is produced? And that to me seems uncertain. The other question about fairness, I think one way, Gary had kind of touched upon this. There's another aspect of de minimis which I find quite intriguing, but was not quantified in our setting, given the type of data that we observed or could not see, which is that the typical package coming through de minimis, just take the CBP numbers, it's $50 billion over 1 billion shipments. So it's about a $50 package. So I don't think U.S. producers of apparel are operating in that space. At least the U.S. producers of apparel that I know are operating at a much higher price point. And so really, the potential beneficiaries of removing the exemption are going to be retailers who themselves are already importing, but simply importing through the formal channel, such as Walmart and Amazon. Now, the issue here is now when we go to Walmart or Amazon, as a consumer, you're sort of at the mercy of what the purchasing manager at Walmart expects you to buy. And so you can go to the store, it might be something that you like, and so you therefore buy it. But often, sometimes you go to the store and you settle with the 3 or 4 options that you have, and you choose the best among them. And really what I think de minimis allows you to do is really to find the ideal thing you are looking for. And that is a form of a benefit to a consumer, which I think it would be quite intriguing to think about. It's also a way for smaller producers to be able to sell directly to the consumer, because they don't have to fill a minimum order size that the large retailers, big box stores would want. And so the point of fairness, I think, there are potential beneficiaries from closing the loophole, and I think what we do in the paper is just try to emphasize the costs and in particular where the consumer costs would lie.
Great, thanks so much. I'm afraid we're out of time on this fascinating issue. I'm sure there'll be more written and said about de minimis. I'd like to thank you all for being here, both here in person and online, and I'd like to thank our three speakers for such enlightening remarks. First, Professor Amit Khandelwal, our own Gary Huffbauer, and Mr. Todd Owen. Thank you so much for being here.